Hi everyone, today we're going back to year 2003 to analyze the shocking loss that former world champion and one of the best players ever, Garry Kasparov, had against a then 15-year-old kid, Timur Radjabov. They met at the prestigious Linares International Chess Tournament, and to add insult to injury, this game was voted the most beautiful game of the tournament. And Garry Kasparov was naturally very angry at this, and he said that this game didn't deserve a beauty prize because he basically made a stupid mistake. Personally, I think that this was a very exciting game and that Radjabov put a lot of pressure to make Garry Kasparov collapse. In any case, let's start with the game. Kasparov started with the move e4, and after e6 and d4, d5 we get a French defense. Here Kasparov played knight to c3, and now black played knight to f6, bishop to b4 is an alternative, but knight to f6 is also very common, and after e5 and knight f to d7, black's idea is to counterattack the center with c5. Kasparov played the move f4, reinforcing the pawn on e5, and after c5 and knight to f3, knight to c6. This is all very natural. Black tries to put pressure on white's center, which is very strong. White tries to hold the center by going bishop to e3. And here Radjabov continued with the move a6, planning to go b5, and after queen to d2 and b5, white played the move a3. One idea is to take on b4. If black goes b4, this would open the a file for the rook. Generally speaking, white doesn't want to take on c5, at least not quickly, because this would simply help black develop. And here black continued with the move queen to b6. Black can take on d4, but black can do this later, and as we see in the game, black has other options with the c-pawn, so queen to b6 is a bit more flexible. It also puts some additional pressure on d4. That's why here Kasparov continued with the move knight to e2, giving some additional protection to the pawn on d4. And here Radjabov played the move c4, changing the position a lot because now black is closing the position and black is having some extra space on the queen side, but white will get a lot of activity on the king side. So here Kasparov played the move g4, planning to go f5, and here Radjabov went h5, which is an interesting idea to fight against this plan. Here white cannot play the move h3 because after pawn takes, now the pawn on h3 is pinned. That's why Kasparov captured on h5, and after rook takes and knight to g3, attacking the rook, rook to h8. Now Kasparov played the move f5. So now black has to be a bit careful because white has a simple idea to take on e6 and then attack this pawn. For example, if black plays something like bishop to b7, planning to castle, white will simply take on e6, and then this pawn can be a target. For example, after knight to g5, black is already having a hard time defending that pawn. Bishop to h3 might follow, eyeing the pawn on e6. But Radjabov here started playing creatively, which is something that we see throughout the game. First he took on f5, and after knight takes, here he played the move knight to f6, creating a discover attack against knight, and now black will manage to develop the pieces more easily. For example, here if white takes, after bishop takes, black is developing this bishop on c8, which very often is a very bad piece in the French defense. Now this bishop is doing great on f5. That's why Kasparov went knight to g3. Now there's the idea to take the knight on f6. That's why Radjabov went knight to g4. And after bishop to f4 and bishop to e6, now black is ready to castle along. And here white went c3, reinforcing this very important pawn on d4. Although this will have some drawbacks, now white is weakening the b3 and d3 squares, which as we see later on, black fully exploded these two squares. And after bishop to e7, knight to g5, now black castle along. Here Kasparov took on e6, and after pawn takes e6, bishop to e2, now we get a very critical moment. Now white is attacking the knight on g4, so black has to make an important decision. Black could actually capture this pawn h2, but at least for a human this looks extremely scary. So for example, after knight takes h2, we see how this knight is just dominated by the bishop. But it seems that black has enough resources to complicate this position. For example, after knight to h5, planning to take the knight on h2, black can try knight to a5, planning to go knight to b3. This would fork the queen and the rook, and if the queen moves away from that square, for example if it goes to e3, now black can try g6, attacking this knight on h5, and this position might actually be playable for black, but I doubt that any human would play this with a knight on h2, or at least it looks a bit scary, but at least I don't see a win for white. Now another idea is to simply move the knight, for example going to h6. Generally speaking, going back is not great, but even so, white here might try to fight for an advantage, but there's no clear advantage for white in this position. Maybe here white has an additional idea that white didn't play in the game, which is to castle short. Because as we'll see, the king on c1 is going to be a bit more exposed, so this position might be interesting for white to try to milk an advantage by exploiting the two bishops and this weak pawn on e6. But even here black still has ideas. For example, bringing a rook to the g file and then going g5. So maybe black underestimated his position, and so did white, because Kasparov thought that his position was a lot better here. And in this position, Rajao played the very creative move knight g takes e5. So here Kasparov didn't take this knight, but let's see what would have happened if Kasparov had taken this knight. White has two ways to capture the knight. One of them is by going d takes e5, and here the idea is to go d4. Now black is pretty much activating a lot of pieces. This pawn on d4 is very strong, and these positions might be playable, but they are very hard to play when you have to defend. For example, after pawn takes and knight takes, this knight is just very powerful. Knight to b3 is an idea, knight to d3 as well, creating a discover attack against the queen. And another alternative here is to castle long, but now black has another important idea in this position, which is to go g5, attacking the bishop on f4, and after bishop takes, d takes e3, black is attacking the queen, and this queen is actually overloaded defending the bishop on g5. So if white takes on c3, black will simply get the piece back and a better position, and if white tries to defend the bishop, black has a few options. For example, black can capture on g5, and after queen takes, black can go b4, and these pawns actually look very scary. Black can start an attack against white's king, so these positions are again very hard to play when you have to defend. Another alternative, and this was probably the best way for white to fight for an advantage, was to capture with the bishop. And now the idea is very similar. Black would capture on e5, and after pawn takes, black will start to get some activity. So here going d4 is probably less strong, because now we traded a few pieces. White can castle, and now there's no ideas like g5 attacking the bishop on f4, because white traded that bishop for knight. So here white should be doing better. But in this position black had another idea, which is bishop to e3, planning to bring the bishop to e3 before going d4. And these positions might be quite playable for white, even slightly better, but again they are very scary to play. First of all, here white cannot castle long, because after bishop to e3, black is pinning the queen and winning material. So white is finding a hard time to castle, and black might continue with bishop to e3 and d4, getting at the very least very good practical chances. So that's why Kasparov wanted to play more solid and went queen to e3, and here Radjabov could have insisted with this idea of the piece sacrifice and leave the knight on e5 by going bishop to d6. Instead he played knight to d7, so now white got the pawn back, and after bishop to h4, here Kasparov had another chance to fight for an advantage by taking the pawn on d5. So now white gets an extra pawn, and if black tries to pin the bishop on e2, white should normally be able to consolidate, for example after queen to g2. Instead Kasparov played queen to g4, and now we get again a messy position. Black went g5. Radjabov complicates the game whenever he can. Here white cannot take on g5, because after rook d to g8, the bishop on g5 is pinned. And after bishop to d2, rook d to e8, pinning the bishop. White castle long, knight to a5. We mentioned this idea of invading on b3. And here comes the decisive mistake, which was probably not that easy to see, and I just want to highlight the fact that Kasparov had been under a lot of pressure throughout many moves. So when you are under a lot of pressure for a lot of moves, or when you have to find very accurate moves to keep the position or even to get an advantage, it is very common to blunder. And this is what happened in the game. So here Kasparov had to go king to b1 with the idea to bring the king to a2, and there we would get a very complicated game. But after the move played in the game, rook d to f1, knight to b3, the king cannot go to b1 because it has to defend the bishop on d2. That's why king to d1 was played. And now after bishop takes, black is removing this very important knight on g3, which defends the f5 square. As we'll see, this is going to be very important because black has this idea to go queen to g6 and queen to b1. So here Kasparov played rook to f7, but let's evaluate some alternatives. The logical follow-up here is to take the bishop on g3, but after queen takes and queen to g6, there's no easy way to prevent queen to b1, which would attack the king. And if white captures with the h-pawn, we get a similar idea. Queen to g6, white is in no time to cover this invasion. For example, after queen to f5, black simply trades queens and then gets an extra rook after taking on h1. So here Kasparov tried to complicate the game by going rook to f7, counter-attacking on d7. Here black could have gained a very large advantage after queen to c6, but after rook to d8, black still kept the advantage. Bishop takes d5, and now queen to g6, we get a similar idea. And even though here white can stop this idea, black will simply trade queens and get this position with an extra piece that Rajao managed to convert. So here after rook d to f8, rook takes and knight takes. Now this pawn h2 is pinned, so white cannot capture. And after bishop to f3, bishop to f4, white even managed to get another pawn, but it was still not enough to hold the position. After bishop to e3, knight to d7, bishop takes and rook to e8, bishop to h6. Here Rajao found again a very creative move. He went knight d to c5 with the idea to activate the knight. And if white takes the knight after rook to d8, this bishop is pinned, so black is going to get the material back. Instead, Kasparov tried bishop to f7, but after rook to e7, bishop to h5, knight to d3, Kasparov had enough and resigned. Here black has a lot of threats like knight to f2, pinning the king and the rook, knight takes b2, or even rook to h7. That's why Kasparov had enough and resigned. So I hope that you enjoyed this very wild game. Even though Kasparov somewhat blundered a piece, Rajao put a lot of pressure and made a lot of creative moves to complicate the game as much as possible. If you want to keep on learning and get better at chess, I have a free course that will provide you with a free training plan for that. So feel free to check it in the description. In any case, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.